morning, everyone. Good evening for some people from the States. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Eungyang Shin, and I will moderate the talk today. I welcome you all to our KU Global Lecture Series focusing on data in the era of digital transformation. Today is the third session, and you may have noticed it's qualitative research insight. So I think this session is extremely important given the fact that we're so caught up by the quantitative analysis or the big data and numbers. In that trend, we might missing out something more qualitative insight. The number is growing every time. We have 378 people registered to this event. And participants are not only from Korea University, but also more than 40 other universities and institutes around the world, which is very exciting as usual. And again, through this lecture, I hope we will able to cultivate an ever richer harvest of insight from data analytics, not only quantitative, but also qualitative. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Annette Lareau. Professor Lareau is Edmund and Louis Kahn Professor in Social Science and Professor of Sociology at Pennsylvania University. She is author of award-winning books. There's so many awards I cannot even mention, but mention a few. The Culture Section Best Book Award from the ASA, AEAS Critic Choice Awards for Unequal Childhood. This book actually made, I think, Professor Lareau really famous worldwide. And today, she will discuss her new book, Listening to People. I really wanted to share a little bit of quotes from this book. I just told Professor Lareau, this is the most touching dedication of any book I've ever read. This says, for my students at University of Pennsylvania, University of Maryland, Temple University, and Southern Illinois University with gratitude. I have learned so much from all of you and all the novices who want to do their own study one day. Oh, I almost cried. Sorry about that, but it's so touching every time I read this. With that dedication, we very much look forward to what Professor Lareau will talk. And after her talk, Professor Ko Eun-chung from Kyunghee University, also Sociology Department, will open up for discussion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Annette Lareau.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. And I really appreciate all of you coming from all over the world to be here with us. I am sharing my screen so that you can see the slides and on my talk this evening. And so let me begin by, of course, Lareau has a book, Normal Accidents, that when you practice things, they work, and then when you try them again, they don't work. But I was unable to advance my slides, so let's see if we can get this to work. I'm extremely grateful to the sponsors of this talk, the Korean University College of Liberal Arts. I'm particularly grateful to Professor Shin, who through many emails organized the talk, and Professor Jung, who is our discussant this evening, as well as Ms. Kim, who helped in many countless ways. So some of you are professors, some of you are graduate students, some of you are undergraduates, some of you may be practitioners. And often you've learned about what I would call the scientific method. And in what I call the scientific method, there's a set of well-known steps where that you plan a design, you formulate a research question, you create hypotheses, which can be accepted or rejected based on the data you collect. You actually collect the data, you assess it, often quantitative data, and you draw conclusions. And so according in this thumbnail sketch, often this is the idea that it's of course very systematic, very rigorous, but it's also quite planful and predictable. And in my comments today, I want to argue that when you do interviews, in-depth interviews or participant observation or qualitative research, that there need to be important adjustments. The research remains rigorous and systematic, but the process is more emergent. It emerges over time. And I'm going to be talking about my book that came out last October, Listening to People from the University of Chicago. It's a deeply practical book. And this way I was guided as a North Star by the book, Howie Becker's book, Writing for the Social Sciences, which is also in that series. And so in participant observation and in-depth interviews, which to be sure have their differences, but nonetheless also have important commonalities, the process rather than hypothesis testing is often you take a step, you gather information, and then often you make an adjustment. You might change, as I'll explain, the question you ask in the interview. You might change what you're focusing on, your observations. You take another step, you gather more information, and then you make an adjustment again. And so this design, adjust, gain access, collect data, adjust, collect more data, reflect, adjust, analyze. This is a process. And importantly, data analysis is woven through data collection. And you need to think about what you're doing and why you're doing it and what you're hoping to learn. And you're trying to narrow your research question. And there are certainly areas of overlap with quantitative research, but I'm going to talk today about qualitative research. And in the book, I talk a little bit about data analysis and writing, which I'll talk about briefly here. But the point is that it's often uncertain path and it varies from project to project. Now, to be sure, this is, in my view, a social science method. There's a research question, there's a design, it's quite systematic. You're trying to compare apples to apples, as I'll explain. There are established methods for data collection. There are standards for data analysis. And of course, in the United States, we have to follow the Institutional Review Board for the Protection of Human Subjects, IRB, and of course, ethical standards. So this is not the same thing as just having a conversation with your neighbor or your family member, nor is it the same as journalism. Qualitative research is a social science method, and it has a different logic, and it has a certain rigorous quality. But because of the emergent nature of it, it often introduces anxiety. And so when I've taught qualitative methods in 4 different universities, I've noticed that the students are very anxious. And I must say, I've done a few studies. I'm doing a study right now of very wealthy people who generally have more than 10 million US dollars. And I'm anxious. And partly that's because I don't really know what I'm doing in the study, even though I got a grant and I need to look like I know what I'm doing. But there are some things you just can't know when you're doing. And so there are often roadblocks. But then, of course, ironically, is you have to act like as if you know what you're doing. And so in moments of performance, such as grant proposals or for students, their proposal defense or their design, or they need to act as if they know what they're doing. In the book, I talk a little bit about this. And I say you should just say what you know at that time. And that's good enough. And you don't know everything, but you have a plan. And the plan and often it's very hard to access a research site, for example, if you're doing participant observation. And then the journal reviewers will say, well, how did you choose the site? Why did you choose that site? And sometimes you felt like, you're going to go anywhere they'll let you in, you'll go. But that's actually not the case, because there are some places you wouldn't go. So when I'm choosing a school for unequal childhoods, I needed a certain grade. I needed the school to have certain qualities. And I would have rejected some schools, which I did. So I think you have a plan here. And even it may not be a perfect plan, but you have a plan and you want to convey to the reader why you're doing what you're doing. And of course, you want to convey that to the people you're studying as well. So to me, I have strong opinions about some things, and I think that some qualitative studies are higher quality than other qualitative studies. I don't think anything goes. And so I think there are strategies for creating high quality data. And I think often having a flexible design where you have a relatively small study where you can get very deep, rich data is very important. And where you can do interviews, where you can do field notes, and that also to adjust the data collection to answer the question, so what? Why is this important? Why do we need to know this? What does it contribute to? Why are we doing this study? And so it's design, adjust. But I think all of us have to begin by doing some dreaming. Who would you like to study? What would you like to study? And here we want, even if it seems crazy, like when I told people I was going to study people who have more than $10 million, they said, oh, yeah, right, who are literally 1% of Americans. And so they're not that easy a population to recruit, especially because I'm not a member of that class. But, I thought, well, let's try it, see what happens. And so even if you want to follow a sports team or, observe in the TV studio or something that seems like and actually when I wrote the book Unequal Childhoods, many people told me I simply could not do it. And they said that people will never agree. But they were wrong. People did agree. But their assessments scared me. So I think you shouldn't bang your head against the wall for the rest of your life, but I would try it not once, maybe 3, 4, 5 times. And if it doesn't go, doesn't go. But I think you should try. And I think you should choose what you want to do, not what your advisor and not what other people. And even with funders, you really think, is this the study I want to be spending my time and energy doing? And so the goal here of deep, rich data is really often understanding lived experience, understanding the meaning of events. Why do people see this as reasonable? What are they thinking? Why does it make sense to them? So in schools, for example, for a lot of working class people, it makes sense not to go to a parent-teacher conference because they're not really going to have an impact on the schooling anyway. It's up to the educators to educate their children. They're peripheral to it in their view. That's not how the teachers see it, but that's how they see it. And they have a point. If you're functionally illiterate, and why should you go to a conference? It's not going to matter. It's up to the teacher, they think. And so you're trying to understand the context, the depth. You want to be there. And so, but that means you need time. And so by definition, the goals then soon meet cold, hard reality. And there you have to make hard choices. And there you're really trying to, again, compare apples to apples. I was talking to a doctoral student yesterday, and she had a study going, and she has 18 interviews in one school and 8 in the other. And I'm like, can't make it 18 and 18, And then she had done a lot of other interviews, but they weren't relevant because she didn't kind of know what she's doing. It took her a while to find it. And now she has a focus. But I think you really want to be systematic and you want to have equal amounts of data, roughly, not perfectly, but roughly. So you want to spend time with them. I think it's better to choose a site that is slightly inferior than to a better site that's further away. You don't want to be spending an hour and a half each way in traffic or on the train. You want to think about, all right, is it possible to make a comparison group? You just can't do it all. And so small is good. I think it's good to make hard choices. It's good to think a little bit about what you in the US we would call your positionality, your race, your age, your class, And you want to think about what you can do. And the reality is you cannot do everything. You cannot do everything you'd like to do. And so you have to make hard choices, but you want to make useful choices. And usually you're trying to make a theoretical generalization, not an empirical generalization. So I'm going to interview, probably around 100 rich people. And I can't say these are representative of rich people in America. I just can't do that. But I can say some of the concerns and issues they face, I believe, are generalizable theoretically to some of the challenges in wealth and transition of wealth and transmission of advantage across generations. And so you want to decide who will you study in a participant observation study, why will you study them, how will you get in? And I believe the research suggests it's much easier to get in through a social tie. So you should decide, I want to study a daycare, I want to study a tech firm. And then you should ask everybody you know, if they know somebody, to do an introduction. And then you want to have a phone call. Do not ask by email. I repeat, do not ask by email or text. Just do by email or text to say, could I have a brief phone call with you? Because people are more likely to turn you down if it's email or text. And you're trying to get there or meet them for a cup of coffee for free advice, write them a thank you note, maybe bring them a small gift. But usually social ties, people will help you often. And also in the universities, Blair Sackett and I, who's a doctoral student, we're writing a book on refugees called Seeking Refuge, Finding Inequality about Refugees. And when she was doing her dissertation, she found that people in universities were very helpful. So even though you might be an undergraduate or graduate student, you don't have a big grant, but contacting professors and professors asking other professors, that's an important resource for you all over the country and all over the world. And sometimes people will help you find people. And so you want to be flexible. So you think, and then finally on interviews, you can keep about 50 people in your head. Sometimes I can keep about 75 or 80 people in my head, but you can't keep 200 people in your head. And so why collect all this data and then throw it away? I mean, you want to be able to you want to learn from the people, you want to be able to use the quotes, you want to transcribe them, understand their life experience. You can't report them as numbers. I mean, that's not the point. Why report them as numbers? The point is to report their words and their lived experience. So if the focus is on meaning and conceptual variation, small is good. And getting huge studies, even if you have the money to do it, I'm just not a fan of it. To be sure, I've done studies of 88 people, which I think are pretty big. But, and also, of course, if you're an undergraduate, it might be 5 interviews. If you're a graduate student, it might be 20. Doctoral dissertation, it depends on your stage and where you are and what you're doing in your field. In my overly ambitious study on unequal childhood, which I do not recommend to you, this was my study, which I had 3 classes and 2 racial groups. And this is a huge study. This is 88 people. Sometimes you can do 2 classes, but then you're going to have heterogeneity within the class, or you're going to turn people away. So some people do an upper middle class, say people with a graduate degree in the US or professional jobs, and then a blue working class. But what to do about lower middle class, people who have like a white collar degree, a white collar job, like a bank teller or something. You just have to be thoughtful. And sometimes I think it's better to restrict your categories, but make them conceptually coherent rather than have kind of everybody and his brother and have a lot of heterogeneity. It's better to have focus. It's very hard to only study 2 racial groups or 2 ethnic groups. And you get beat up on this all the time. And I have a standard answer, which is it's a really good question, but you have to make hard choices. And then you're trying to triangulate with other studies, but you can only do what you can do. And so again, and then in the most unusual feature of unequal childhoods, there were 12 families with research assistants. I did observations. I asked 19 to get 12, which I thought was a pretty good response rate. They were paid $550 in current dollars. We usually visit them every day for about 20 visits, usually about 3 weeks. The visits lasted 2 or 3 hours and was a multiracial team. I am a big fan of the family observation method, and I would love to see more researchers using this method. And it is possible to do this. Blair Sackett and I, in this book on refugee families, she did observations. She did observations with 5 families once a week for about a year and a half, going once a week. But other people do other things, and it is possible. People agree. And especially now with reality TV, people agree. And you just kind of hang out, get to know them, and learn what their daily lives are like. But still, you have to make difficult trade-offs. And in Unequal Childhoods, I had a really hard time where I needed African-American families. And so in the school, I had originally designed it as a school-based study. And it was a big problem what school to choose, because there are very few schools that have class and race integration in the US. Everything's like upper middle class or, poor kids of color. It's a very segregated society. So I chose a school that was predominantly white, but had about 10% African-American kids in it. And I got parents to agree to be interviewed, but I could not get any of the parents agree to be in the observational study. And I tripled the honorarium, and they still didn't agree. And my husband said, it's not the money, And so in the end, now there was a single mom, and she would have agreed, I believe. I didn't ask her, but I'm pretty sure she would have agreed. She was in the classroom. But then I would have had 2 white middle-class families, because I'd already done them, who were 2-parent. And I didn't want to have 2-parent white families who were middle class and single-parent Black African-American families. So in the end, I left the school. I got other families, and I moved it away from a school-based study to more about family life, which was, at the time, I lost sleep for weeks over this. But if I was going to be apples to apples, then I needed the family structure to be the same. Now, among the poor families, the family structure was not the same, but everybody, then mostly there were single parent families. So here's a hypothetical, but the thing is that the numbers escalate incredibly rapidly. And so here's a hypothetical study of family school relationship of mothers with children 3 to 6. In a traditional public school, or what we call a charter school, which is paid for public money. Again, African-American and white moms, again, upper middle class, lower middle class, and working class. So if you have, I think you want to have about 7 people as the minimum, not people in a cell. I do know Mary Waters is more like 18. She's at Harvard. So people disagree, but I think if you have 7 or 8 people, and across race, you'd have 14 to 22. I think that's enough to be, make some useful claims. But you can see how the numbers just escalate. And you see a huge difference between going from 7 to 11. So it goes from either 42 to 66. And each of the interviews have to be transcribed and coded, and maybe you have a gift for them. So small is good. It's just the same, Maybe you would just do 2 classes and 2 races, for example, and maybe you could have a smaller number of people. Lots of books have been written on 50 families. There's so many good books that have been written on 50 families. So immediately once you have it, people are going to say, what are you doing? What's your study? And you need a speech, what I call an elevator speech, a speech you could convey in the length of a time of an elevator ride. And here's a typical elevator speech of a young person, including me when I was young. I'm studying how social class is correlated with educational achievement. I want to decode the mechanisms through which these processes unfold. I would say that's a bad elevator speech. It has a lot of jargon. It's unclear. It's not clear what you're doing or why you're doing it. Not to mention the delivery. Like a lot of time I just say, oh, what are you doing? And people start going, like this, and they look down and they, so I think you're trying to say it kind of simple, So I might say, I'm interested in understanding the school experiences from children in different walks of life. I'm interested in understanding the school experiences of children in the different walks of life. That's better than saying social class is correlated with educational achievement. And then I think immediately you want to say what you're asking from them. I'd like to visit your classroom twice a week, and I could be a helper if you need. You want to be very clear. So you need an elevator speech. You want to tell everybody the same speech, not telling other people different speeches. And then there's this issue of, and I think reasonable people disagree about this, but I believe both in people who are school teachers, who are refugees, people who are swimmers, people who are insiders, they have access and trust, and they can often gain access very easily. But they may have taken for granted knowledge and they miss some things. Outsiders are often presumed to be ignorant. They can ask about cultural mores. If I visited Korea, I could ask about things you couldn't ask because you would be expected to know it. And so you can ask things more freely as a stranger. So, but both of them have challenge. You may misunderstand something. You may make a mistake as an outsider. And so I don't think there's really one best way here, but I think we want to be mindful of our own position. So you want to have a very clear elevator speech and know what you're asking people to do. And so with my wealth project, I say, I don't ask students or in-laws, but otherwise I say, oh, if you know anybody, and maybe next time you see them, you have a meal with them, maybe you could say, could you give their contact information to Annette Lareau, and then I would have a brief phone call. By talking to me, they're not agreeing to be in the study, but only to learn more about it. So you want to be very clear about what you're asking people to do. And tell everybody the same thing. Figure out your role in the field. Figure out if you're going to intervene, if kids hit each other or not. If people tell you a secret, you can't, what you can do with that or not. And sometimes you can tell people, unless it's life-threatening, I'm not going to tell your mom, kind of thing. You have to decide what you're going to do. So there are people, in my mind, especially people using quantitative methods, who immediately kind of go for, they try to attack your study. With such a small sample, how do you know your results are representative? That's a very common question. So in the book, I talk about a sample answer. You could say, well, my study seeks to go deeper, to understand the meaning of events, and to improve our understanding of key social processes that are missed by other studies. Then people often say, well, doesn't it change things to have you be there? And you say, yeah, it does change things. But it's tiring for people to act differently day after day after day, and people do adjust. But I'm sure it's still different. I'm not saying, but the question is it different, say, by social class or by gender? Is there some kind of reactivity that's different? People ask about reliability. Will you get the same? And that's why it's good to go over and over again, because people get used to you. It's good to keep doing interviews over and over again until you stop learning new things. And often that's when you know your study is done, when you're no longer learning new information. And then they say, well, can your results be replicated? And I'm saying, well, not exactly, because my study is confidential. The sites are unique, but there should be a pattern. Like, I think my results should be consistent with quantitative data. They should be consistent with qualitative data. So I think, anyway, so the point is you can prepare little speeches for what, and when I was younger, this used to really scare me when people asked me these questions, made me nervous. And so I think having a little speech ahead of time can be helpful. So then on the interviews, in the book, and I talk about this a lot longer, but you really want to go deep in the interview. And so you want to have breadth and depth is critical. So that means often you can only cover a limited number of topics, and you're trying to understand what it means to them. This is not survey research. And so often each interview is unique, and you sort of probe 2 or 3 issues. I did a study of upwardly mobile first generation college students. And I would often start with the question, tell me about the family you grew up in. And then a little bit in, I would say, were there food shortages in your house? And often by asking that, you're sort of signaling with it, I know there are often food shortages. It's okay to talk about that. And that kind of really is very helpful for them saying no, but their electricity got off. You're kind of trying to create a safe space for the respondent. The first 15 minutes are crucial in the interview, and you're trying to train the respondent. It's a collaboration. So you're trying to train the respondent what would be most helpful for you. So if somebody goes on and it's very superficial and you don't correct them, you're training the respondent that that's a good answer. But if you stop the respondent and you say, tell me about a day when that happened, or can you think of a recent example? You're training the respondent the kind of information that would be helpful for you. You want to show that you're listening. You want to look like you're listening. Even if you're trying to think of all the questions you should ask, you should be listening. And you want to use the respondent's words as much as possible. So here's an example of many probes that I think are helpful probes. Can you tell me more about that? Repeating the last word and waiting. Silence is an excellent probe. Can you think of a recent example of that? What was that like for you? And then sometimes you do. Some people say this, some people say that. What's it like for you? And so here's an interview for Unequal Childhood by a very smart, capable, conscientious student. And she was interviewing a white working class mom who had 3 kids. And she was interviewing this about the kids' organized activities. And, she was the first semester graduate student. Why would she know this? So this was the question. The mom has just said, Jim's 21, Trishie's 14, Dougie. No, the mom says Dougie. Now notice that the interviewer says, now if you were describing Doug to someone who's never met him, what would you say to give a picture of him? So a little rift has opened up. The mom's saying Dougie. She's saying Doug. So she's not really listening enough. You want to use the words the mom is using. And then the mom says, he's a good kid. Some days he's a bad kid. He's smart. To me, he's smart. Some days I have problems with his behavior. He's good. Kid's 10. So notice that the mom has made in one very brief comment 5 different points. Son's a good kid some days, he's a bad kid others, he's smart, sometimes he has problems, he's good. So this is the immediate problem with in-depth interviewing. Because you're all of a sudden you're at a road and there are 5 different roads. Which road do you go down? And the answer to that is your research question and why you're doing the study to start with. Now, some of these are kind of related, but you're trying to decide. And this study was about organized activities, So, but then the mom has praised the kid 4 times. To me, unfortunately, the interviewer had this. Can you talk more about that? Problems with behavior. But to me, the respondents praised her son 4 times. He's good, he's smart, he's very smart, he's good. And I would worry that the mom's going to think the interviewer is out to get her or make her look bad or criticizing. Moms are very protective of their kids. I would try to go with something positive. And if it was really important, I would come back to it later. All moms have problems with their kids. Tell me about a recent example. I would do that much deeper in the interview, not in the beginning. So I would think, tell me in a recent example in the last few days of him being a good kid. Did something happen? That's the Prof I would do. But this very problem that you get too many answers and you don't quite know what to do and you're trying to figure it out and you don't have enough time, that's the nature of interviewing. And so it's very chaotic. You're making a lot of decisions at the same time. You want to use the respondent's words. You want to slow the interview down in the first few minutes. You want to be positive and build trust. You want to look interested, and you want to talk as little as possible. And so, can you think of an example of him being a good kid? And then I would slow it down. When did that take place? Where were you? Were you outside, or were you in the house, or were you in the car? What was he wearing? Do you remember what he said? I might try to spend 5 minutes on him being a good kid. So it's like somebody's over your shoulder and you can visualize it. And then you're training him. I want to know what he's wearing, what time of day it was, where he was sitting, where you were sitting, what tone of voice. That's what I want to know, which is what I want to know. And then I want vivid, detailed, rich accounts. And I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to be polite about it. And the whole thing is that okay with the respondent? So you're watching to make sure you have their informed consent. And if they don't want to talk about it, then it's over. We're going to go to a new topic. So you're trying to listen deeply, but then you're also trying to nudge them or push them along a little bit. So with rich people right now, I'm finding Zoom to be very hard because in face-to-face interactions, I believe you can sometimes just talk about things better face-to-face than you can on the phone or on Zoom, and especially things that are sensitive. And so Zoom, I think, works okay, and it's certainly better than nothing. And the phone works okay, but for some topics, it's really better to be in person if you can. So interviewing, after you do the interviews, you want to write a little memo. You want to reflect on what you've learned. You want to say how this learns. And then for field notes, I want to we could talk all night about interviewing, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about field notes. And in the book, I use this acronym WRITE, with W being who, what, when, where, how, R being the reaction, the response. So if I'm watching a kid and I say the kid took the ball and slammed it against the wall, I want to say, well, how did the other boy right next to the wall react? What did that boy do? And then also sometimes you want to say inaction. They didn't say anything. They scowled or they looked mad, but they didn't say anything. When they said it, how quickly they said it, timing, how slowly or how quickly, and then nonverbal emotions. Frowning, smiling. And in interviewing, you want to write down people's nonverbal emotions too. And you can put that in the account. Leaning back in his chair, or smiling broadly, or chuckling, or looking sad, looking at the floor. You can say a little bit when people are talking, if you can remember, if you can write down notes. So in field notes, you want to go step by step. You don't want to skip steps once you figure out what's important to study. A little dialogue can go a long way. And in the book, I provide accounts of how you can write very vivid accounts with just a few sentences. It's hard to remember everything people say, but usually you can remember a few sentences. You want to evoke the smells, the sounds, the lights, the texture. And you don't want to record every detail. You have to focus, and you have to focus on what you're interested in. And you have to know what you're interested in, which means you have to know why you're doing the study. And that means you can't study everything. You have to let some things go. So in choosing your priorities, it's guided by the critique of the literature, the framing of the research question, and the data. So it's like a three-corner hat. You're kind of running around in a little circle. Right, the literature says this, but there's a weakness in literature. Your research question says that. The data says this. The literature, your research question, the data, you're kind of running around in a circle trying to figure out how they're all connected. And it's not obvious, obviously. So here's an example of field notes. This is by a doctoral student who wrote superb field notes from Unequal Childhood. We were visiting a white middle-class girl, Melanie Hanlon. She had 3 brothers. The father was an accountant. He had a master's degree. The mother was a church secretary. She just had a community college degree. And there were homework battles in this family's house almost every night that often had tears and various problems. So this is the research assistant's notes. Mrs. H sits down next to Melanie and Harry. Harry's the brother, comes in the room. She asks Melanie how it's coming and then quickly says, "Oh, Melanie, look, you're still doing the same thing. Now you know that's not going to work. Go through it again. What's X times X?" So Miss H was grasping a pencil in her heart, great word, grasping. And Melanie began to write down an answer. Ms. H began to impatiently and forcefully tap the point on the composition. So she captures that sound, basically. When Melanie incorrectly wrote down something, Ms. H would tap heavily and say, "Do it again. Now check your work." Melanie finished the question and triumphantly said, "I got it right." Triumphantly, great word. Ms. H said, "Good, now do 2 more." Melanie mumbled something, but I can't do them by myself. So they're very unusual words here. The words have a freshness and a crispness to it. And so she is, you could write, rather than saying, say, you could say mutters, explains, grumbles, moans, protests, whines. Cheerfully, chirpily, enthusiastically, warmly. They're words of feeling words or feeling words you can get on the internet. And those can help provide more variety. Obviously, a thesaurus is very helpful. And so there are pleasant words, gleeful, ecstatic, jubilant, or fearful, suspicious. So you're just trying to convey emotion in this field note, and the nonverbal signals, which is, I think, very helpful in this field note. So now, in an ideal world, it would have been good to know what the actual math problem was. That would have been helpful to know, and what the incorrect answer was. That would have been good to know too. But you can't get everything. And she might have told us a little bit about how Melanie looked. She says she was triumphant, but she didn't say, did she smile? Or, you could have seen what her face looked like. And so she has detail, unusual words, she has verbal, she has nonverbal, and it's a very beautifully written, detailed field note that captures, you can kind of be able to visualize it as a reader. You're painting a picture. So field notes you need to write within 24 hours of the lifeblood of the project. You should not go into the field unless you have time to write field notes, because years later you will depend on them. And they're valuable to capture social interaction. You really can't get that in interviews, either because social desirability or because people can't provide an account. I mean, parents yell at kids all the time, cut it out, don't do that. They get mad at kids. That's very hard to convey in an interview, partly because parents are embarrassed and partly just because it's hard for people to report. So there are lots of things that are just better observed than interviewed about. And so one of the huge challenges for qualitative research is finding a focus, because of course you could have 4 or 5 different projects here in one study, and there's no one right way, so you just have to do what you're interested in. So there, I think it's really important You're trying to learn, you reflect, you learn more, it's iterative. But after a few weeks and a few days of data collection, you really need to stop. Take stock and make some decisions like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Where is this going? And you need to sort of focus. Who are you in conversation with? Who would you be citing? If you were writing an article, who would be the reviewers? What field is it in? It's in sociology of education, sociology of the family, social inequality, race. So why are you doing this? So you really need to find a focus. And then you do that some more, and then you find a focus again. And so even when you're 2/3 of the way through data collection, I don't think you need to find your focus right off, but I think by about half to 2/3 of the way through data collection, you should kind of have some sense of why you're doing the project. But that's very different than having a hypothesis before you begin. And so you have to be flexible. But then at some point, you have to decide what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so your journey is from a research topic to a research question. The topic is a subject area, studying women in prison. A research question has an answer. So you're not studying women in prison, children's activity, police. You're asking a question. They're competing answers. You're asking a question where you do not know the answer. Why bother to do research if you know the answer? So you really want to not know the answer when you start. And so you want to refine your research question by a discipline, a person, a scholar. Like I really think the work of Pierre Bourdieu is incredibly interesting. I find the ideas very interesting. I'm excited to read his papers, even though they're a little bit hard to read. And that kind of guides and narrows my data collection. But it doesn't really matter. But there's a concept that you find exciting and that you want to. So you might think of it, Howie Becker describes it as like walking into a room where there's a cocktail party. When we used to do that before the pandemic. And there are little groups of people, and you're trying to figure out which little group you're going to join. Which intellectual conversation are you going to join? So you can say, I'm doing something that's a friendly amendment. I'm trying to make the research a little better. Here are different ways you can think. Writing all the questions on a piece of paper, talking to a friend, writing a junior journal, reading an article, writing a memo, anything that's helped you answer a question in the past. So you need time to think, ways to think. It's not going to happen naturally. You need to think during data collection. So though about no later than 2/3 of the way through, you're absolutely clear what you're doing. So then you can collect data, and in particular, you can look for disconfirming evidence. Maybe you're wrong, maybe you got it wrong, maybe it's not correct. And so you need to challenge yourself and imagine you got it wrong and look for data to contradict your evidence and make sense of it. And so in the book, I talk about this a little bit longer, but there was a young man, and he was in my class. And he was doing a study where he was observing dogs. And my book, Unequal Childhoods, was about social class differences in child rearing. And people have told me that working class people often give directives to dogs, like cut it out, don't do that. And middle class people reason with dogs. Well, just let's wait a minute and then we'll go outside. Or are you hungry yet? Like they'll reason with dogs. And so he was interested in that, about class and dogs, just like class and child rearing. He was interested maybe in race and how Eli Anderson, pets are a flashpoint for racial tension. He was interested in ideas of citizenship and whether family, like if pets were part of the family and who constitutes the family. And he was working in a homeless shelter. And the kids weren't allowed outside. There wasn't a notion of kids needing fresh air and exercise, but there was a big definition of pets needing fresh air and exercise. So he ultimately, but there were different literatures. There was no one right way. There were different data collections. But he had to choose, in the end, he chose citizenship. So there are lots of ways to find a focus. And here are some of the ways that involve getting feedback and listening to negative feedback and not being too narrow too soon, but also not too late. So then in the book, I talk about strategies for data analysis. There's lots written about coding and data analysis, and I discuss that. But you want to be systematic about it, again, to make sure you're not just imposing your views, but in fact, the findings are in the data. People worry a lot about the mistakes they make in the field, and they are very painful, but most are not consequential. Almost every study I know of has had mistakes, and they're just part of the price of doing business. I wouldn't worry about them myself. So summing up, I think we need to recognize qualitative research is different than the traditional scientific method, that there are flexible designs, small studies, but there is rigor in crucial aspects of designs and data collection and data analysis. I value studies that try to answer the question, so what, and make an intellectual contribution to the field. And the final point here is that the best qualitative research is done by young people. It's not done by people my age, it's done by young people. And every day I look forward to reading new work done by young people, because some of the best work in the field is done by young people. And I wish you well in your research journeys. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. You just showed that research process is different from that of quantitative research, as the focus is often uncertain in early stages in qualitative study. And Professor Lareau just showed that research question also evolves significantly over time. Hence, it is appropriate for qualitative researchers to be a little confused and enjoy the challenge along the way. Interestingly, I am a quantitative researcher, and most of the challenges you mentioned and tips and techniques to overcome is echo a lot to quantitative studies as well. So these tips, I think we can easily expand and exportable to the quantitative world as well. So thank you very much for the very insightful talk. So as time is running out, I just wanted to ask you questions about the digital transformation of the moment. We are moving into this Zoom and the digital world. Do you have any comments or thoughts for those people conducting qualitative research in the digital space, which is very different?
Yes, I think that people can and have done interesting and important work in digital spaces. And I think we're still learning, but particularly if you have some kind of relationship with a person ahead of time, then Zoom, I think, can work incredibly well. But even if you're talking to a stranger, it is possible to work it out. For our book on seeking refuge, we did do interviews with refugees, Swahili-speaking refugees. We had Swahili-speaking research assistants do them. And usually we use phone, because for low-income people, data on your phone is really expensive. And so we couldn't use Zoom. We had to use the phone. And sometimes the interview stopped and started 3 or 4 times. But I think, I have an undergraduate research assistant, and he was doing a study. And he did texting, and he just looked up a public Instagram list from a high school. And he wrote a very casual note, like, hey, like, what's up? He said, and slang and everything. And he got a lot of respondents, and he interviewed them, and it worked fine. And so I think we have to be flexible. There's no reason why it needs to be formal. I think they're trying to understand people's worlds. It's extremely tricky with Facebook and Instagram, and becoming friends with people, but then you're studying them and you need their permission, and then should it be reciprocal? Do you want them to see your life? But normally it's a normal reciprocity. So the digital world I thought that Forrest Stewart wrote a beautiful ethnography called Ballad of the Bullet about online presence for some young low-income Black kids in Chicago. And the judges and everybody misunderstood their posturing with guns and things on online presence. So, of course, everything's a performance. Online is performance, right? But interviews are a performance. And so it's not like interviews are real and online's not real. I mean, they're both performances. So I think there is benefit to being face-to-face, but I think you can do quite a lot of research on Zoom and on digital technologies using texting, Instagram, et cetera. You can also go over and have people talk about their phone. Like, what's going on in this picture? Did you post that or not? So you can go sit next to them while they're doing their phone. You can ask them what's going on. So you can kind of ask their interpretation of their online presence. And that can be very rich to have a video that they post and then you have them explain what's going on in the video. That gives you new depth, which is very helpful.
Thank you very much. I mean, this whole talk and discussion was really wonderful. Thank you again for Professor Ko Woon-jung for the wonderful discussion. And thank you for the students and professors who raised questions through the chat. Thank you very much for Professor Annette Lareau. How can I express this gratitude? Thank you very much. It was really wonderful and to see you on the screen, even though we're meeting here. And also, I wanted to say thank you very much for our staff. Eunjae Kim and Sumin Song and Jin-tae Bae for helping us to make this possible. And thank you for all the attendees and participants and our special guest Hae-jung-jo here today. Thank you very much. And hopefully I will see you next. Our final talk will be the February 11th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.